We are back, and this week we are going to work on quilting our first quilt top. So if you watched last week, you saw that we walked you through how to make floppy, and this is a really fun, super beginner friendly quilt that we have the free pattern for in our subscriber library. So we've got the link below in the description so you can go and get the pattern, and you can see it's called floppy because it's got all of these adorable retro floppy disks that, of course, nobody today knows what they actually are anymore. But go ahead and grab the pattern, make the quilt top. And if you made it with us last week and are ready to quilt it, we are going to walk you through how to do a super easy free motion quilting motif that you as a beginner can do to finish your own quilt. Before we can actually quilt the quilt, we need to get two things. The first thing we need is a quilt back. And you'll see in the pattern instructions is going to tell you how much fabric you're going to need. And we're going to calculate that based on a width of between 80 and 90 inches. We're going to take two lengths of fabric, one, matching lengths, and two, and we're going to sew them together along the selvage edge. And so that's going to give you, depending on the fabric you pick, between 80 and 90 inches. When you're trying to decide what fabric you want, something to keep in mind, we use solids on most of our quilts. It's cost effective. They're usually a little bit cheaper than prints. We love Kona cottons. But they do show the quilting. Something I don't mind. I quilt professionally. I love quilting. I love that the quilting shows, so that doesn't bother me. But when you're a beginner, a lot of times people don't necessarily want the quilting to show quite so much, and a print's going to hide that. So if you have a busier fabric, a busier print, that's going to help to hide your quilting more than a solid would. So it's just really preference on how you want to do that. Another thing to keep in mind, A, this is your first quilt. B, it is the back, and it doesn't really matter. So don't stress too much over whether your quilting is perfect or if it shows on the back. Okay, so after we have picked out our fabric, we're going to cut two lengths, and it's going to be the width. So we're going to have the length of the fabric, the length of the quilt is going to be covered in those two halves. You can also buy wide back fabric as well, and that's going to usually be about 108 inches wide. If you find a wide back, you're not going to have to sew your two pieces together like I'm going to do here. You're going to be able to skip that step, buy the width that you need, and you're ready to go. They are super awesome if you find them. So the width that we need is going to be the width of the quilt top plus 6 to 8 additional inches. And what that's going to do is that's just going to give you that extra leeway on the sides to make sure that you don't go over the side, have the top not line up correctly, and then we'll just trim it off when we're done. So I have, my finished quilt was about 59 inches. So I cut two pieces of fabric, each at about 64 inch, 59 plus 6, 65 inches. I have to do the math in my head again. So I've just got two of them, and I'm going to go ahead and pin them together or just line them up. They don't really necessarily need to be pinned. Along the selvage. Now I'm going to leave the selvage on right now while I sew it, but I'm not going to leave it on afterwards because the selvage will, and we talked about last week, the selvage will shrink at a different rate and it might create some puckers along that back seam, and I don't want that. So I'm going to leave them on because it makes it really, really easy to line them up and get a straight edge. Then I'm going to sew a nice big seam. I'm actually going to go ahead and I'll show you where I'm going to line it up on my sewing machine to get a big seam. That's going to allow me the ability to just trim that off afterwards when I'm all done with the seam, and then I don't need to worry about if it's a perfectly straight line because the seam itself is going to be straight. So to sew these together, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to line up, like I said, the two selvages. That's why I'm going to leave them on. But then I'm going to need to do an extra big seam. Normally for a backing, I do roughly about 1/2 inch is about how big I want the seam. I do like them a little bit bigger than the 1/4 inch just because then it gives me a little more durability in that backing as you're quilting it together. So I'm going to, for ease, I'm just going to keep it lined up along the outside edge of this silver plate in my sewing machine because this one in here with the line, that's my 5/8 inch, and that's going to be too small. It's not going to give me anything to cut off. But I like to have an actual edge so that I'm not just guessing. I'm also going to backstitch when I do the when I put the backing together to make sure that it holds those together, those sides together as I'm going. And then I'm just going to sew all the way down the length. One thing to keep in mind is if you do have wrinkles in your backing fabric, make sure that you iron it. Those are not going to go away magically after you quilt it. They are going to be cemented in actually, and it's going to be hard to keep those puckers out. So make sure that you take the time to do a really good job ironing the back of your quilt so that everything lays nice and flat when we get it all put together. Now that we have the back done, the third layer that you need for a quilt is going to be the batting. And there's going to be a couple different ways that you can buy batting. One, you can buy it on a roll and have it cut. It's usually by the yard. Another is you can buy it in a package like this. The package is nice just because it's going to have all of the directions. It's going to have washing directions. It's going to have your quilting directions. Batting is going to have a specific distance that it is okay to quilt it, and that's going to make sure that it doesn't come apart or pile or fall apart inside the quilt over the years. So most batting is going to be between 3 to 4 inches. Some of them go up to 8 to 10 inches. It just depends. So just make sure that you're paying attention to that. Also, like I said, make sure that you know how to wash it. So if you don't buy it in a package, you buy it on a roll, it should still have some information there, some washing information there, or else most manufacturers are going to have all that online. What I'm going to recommend that you use today is an 80-20 batting. It's 80% cotton, 20% polyester, and it is a fantastic overall general all-purpose batting, and it's very easy to use. It's super affordable, and it's usually readily available at any of your quilt shops or big box stores. They should have an 80-20 batting. Some of the brands that I do like Warm and Natural. I like Quilter's Dream. I like Hobbs. Those are ones that I have used. There's a few other ones that are out there. So just kind of check around, see what you think. But today what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the stuff that was cut off the roll. And so the same thing, just like the backing, I do want it a little bit bigger than the quilt top. I want it about 4 to 6 inches bigger than the quilt top. That's going to give me at least 2 inches all the way around, like I said, to make sure that we don't accidentally push the quilt top off and have a section without any batting in it. Also, most battings on the roll are going to be at least 90 inches. So we're just going to go for the width. So we're going to buy about 64 inches worth of batting, and that's going to give us plenty. In a package, it's going to tell you exactly on there what the dimensions are, so you can make sure that you get enough to cover your quilt top plus those few extra inches. Now that we have all 3 of our layers ready to go, we need to put them together, and there's really a couple of ways that you can do this. The first one, then the one that I prefer, is quilt basting spray, and this is stuff you can find at any of your quilt shops, big box stores. You can buy it on Amazon, and it's just a lightweight glue that's going to hold your layers together. The other one that you can use is you can use safety pins. When you're using safety pins, you're going to want to go ahead and put them probably about 5 inches apart, just all around the quilt. And kind of, a lot of times you can do like a little bit of a grid system. Just keep in mind that you're going to want to take those out before you quilt the area. So you're going to be taking them out as you move through the quilt. Don't try to quilt over the safety pins. It will be a mess trying to get them out later. Also, if you do decide that you like safety pins, there are some special safety pins made for quilting that have a little bit of an angle in them. And those ones make it kind of nice to get in and out. Since you're going to be doing it on a flat surface like this, you're not really able to pick it up and be on the back and the front. You're going to be doing it all from the top. So those angle ones are nice. They make it a lot easier to get those in. So those are kind of the 2 main ways to baste a quilt. So I'm going to show you with using the basting spray. It's a little bit faster. It does cost a little bit more because you have to buy the basting spray, but in my opinion, the time savings are totally worth it. So what we're going to do, first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the quilt top out, and you're just going to model the layout out as flat as possible. I have it on a table here. You can see I've got extras hanging over the edges. We'll deal with that as we come to it. Biggest surface you can find is definitely going to be the most helpful. You can also do this on the floor. So if you lay it down on the floor, don't worry, it's totally doable. I'm going to start in the middle though. Whatever way I do it, I want to kind of work on part of it at a time. So in this, I'm going to go ahead and start in the middle. And I'm going to take my basting spray and just spray a light coating, very light. It doesn't really take a whole lot. Then I'm going to grab my batting. And the same thing, we want to be working from the middle. And the batting is nice because it comes folded in half, and that folded in half is the center for the length. Also, on your batting, there's going to be usually some little pokies. If you look at it, it's going to look like it got poked with a pin. Where it goes in, the dimples, is the top, and where it pokes out on the back is going to be the bottom. So I want to make sure that that goes down. Luckily, the way that they fold this is with the top in. So all I have to do is take my middle fold and line it up along the seam line of my backing, and that's going to get me right about center. Now the basting spray is sticky, but it's not like a permanent glue, so you can definitely pick it up and move it around. So I'm going to lay that flat, and then I'm going to take my top layer of the batting and I'm going to bring it over the other side. The biggest thing to keep in mind as you're doing this is keeping everything flat. If you have a crease or a fold or a bend in here now, you will have a crease or a fold or a bend in it later when you're trying to quilt it. So work slowly to make sure that everything is laying flat, the back is flat underneath. Take that little bit of extra time. All right, I should have nice, good coverage. It's pretty centered. Now, after I have attached all of this section, oh, my seam, I think, came up a little bit here. After I've attached that section, you can actually hit it with an iron, and that's going to help set that basting spray just a little bit. It doesn't take a lot, but just by heating that basting spray up just a touch, it's going to make it just a little stickier and hold it in place. I have actually done with the basting spray, I have started a quilt and put it away and had it take me about a year to finish. I know, don't judge. And the basting spray helped while it was folded and in the closet and everywhere. So it's pretty durable. Let's make sure that we get the batting started. Okay, so now what I'm going to do here, now that I've got my next layer, I am going to go ahead and fold back the batting. Not too far, just back to where I've already sprayed. And then I'm going to add a little bit more and keep going. And I'm just going to go ahead and actually finish out this side first. I'm not going to try to work back and forth. I never need to really do it that way. Hit it with a little bit of an iron. But I am going to put the entire batting on before I mess with the quilt top. I like to do them in 2 steps. And then this should be the last. And my batting is going to probably pretty much cover all of the backing lengthwise. Perfect. All right, hit that with an iron just to set it. I do not wash batting ahead of time. I know that there are some, I think that they say you can. If you have a lot of folds in your batting, if it was in a package, you can fluff it in the dryer for a little bit. But don't wash it. Just throw it in a low, tumbled low for like 20 minutes, and that will help to get out folds and creases if you bought a packaged batting. All right, so now we're going to just go the opposite direction. And I will warn you, quilting can be a workout. So when you're done, you can put in your Fitbit that you exercised. Also, do be careful a little bit where you're spraying this. If you use the basting spray, it is going to get a little sticky. And it can put a little bit of sticky like in your carpet or your floor. So if you've got like a hard floor that you can just mop afterwards, that's usually a little bit better than doing it right on top of carpet. If you're doing it on top of carpet, I know a lot of people put like a sheet or something down and do it on top of a sheet. That way you can just throw the sheet in the washer and not worry about the glue making your carpet sticky. Just about done with this layer. One more. All right, so that step is done. Because this is a little bit of a skinnier quilt top, it does fit on my table. Otherwise, like I said, you want to make sure that you're moving it around the whole surface. So I'm going to go back to the center, find my center seam, because it's going to be the easiest to line my quilt up on that center mark. If you have a lot of extra, if you're doing like a baby quilt and you still have the 2 lengths, or a smaller quilt, you can also do it just from the top or the bottom. And then it's going to give you a nice big piece at the bottom of it. We'll just take both sides of the scraps and find something to use them for later anyway. All right, so now we're going to just do the exact same process with the quilt top, making sure that it is centered and lined up inside the quilt top. If you've got extra, you're going to see some of my extra strings here. Cut those off as you're putting it together. You don't want to be dealing with those while you're quilting. So I'm going to pull some of those little extra threads off. All right, and then after I've got it centered and in place, I'm just going to fold back and spray underneath. Okay, it is now basted and ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to move the quilt top out of the way a little bit, and we're going to talk about free motion quilting and what we need to do to our sewing machine to get it set up and ready to go. The first thing that we need to talk about when we are free motion quilting is the setup of the machine. So when I'm free motion quilting, the first thing I want to do is create as much flat space as possible. So if this means moving my sewing machine to the dining room table, setting up some folding tables around it, whatever I can do to get as much of the quilt sitting on top of a flat surface as possible. Anything that's hanging over the edge is going to cause drag, and it's going to be harder to move around. So create as much flat surface as you can. Second thing is we do need a free motion foot. So this is the one for my machine. Most of them have like a spring on it. That's how you can kind of tell they're free motion, but they're all going to be a little bit different. So check your manufacturer for your machine and see on the free motion foot. If you don't have a free motion foot and you still want to make sure that you get your quilt top finished, you absolutely can do straight lines. If you have a walking foot, that's a great way to do some free motion quilting. And you can just do straight lines every few inches or close together depending on how you want it quilted. And that would totally work, and it will get your quilt finished and ready to use. So I'm going to go ahead and put my free motion foot on my machine and just tighten that up. The next thing that you're going to want to keep in mind is free motion quilting does go through quite a few bobbins. So I recommend having a few of them filled to kind of prevent having to stop and fill bobbins in the middle. You have to unthread it and move it all around. So definitely I would fill probably about 3 or 4 bobbins worth of thread before you get started. And the last thing that we're going to do, make sure this goes back in right, is we're going to lower our feed dogs. And those are just the little spiky things that move your fabric around on your machine. And what that's going to do is that's going to mean that I am now controlling how the fabric moves. The machine isn't going to be moving the fabric at all. I'm going to be doing all of that. So those are the 3 kind of main things that we want to first off get started as we begin free motion quilting. Next, we need to look at the actual design we're going to do. The design we're going to do today is what I call my modern meander. And it literally is just going to be lines back and forth. But the thing that you're going to do is you're going to vary them. So some are going to be wider, some are going to be closer. There's no rhyme or pattern to this though. Here you can come back along the top edge, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that to kind of fill those spaces in. The next row, we're going to come in and we're just going to fill in those spaces as we're doing the next section. And we're going to fill all the way across the top. So I definitely recommend grabbing a piece of paper and sketching this out. This is also a fun one if you do it. We're going to go ahead and do it horizontally across the quilt. So it's going to look like this across the quilt top, and I'll show you how we're going to actually move the quilt top to make that happen. But if you went the other way, this also becomes some fun water ripples, and it just goes back and forth this way, and then you would work your way back across the quilt this way. So as you get used to this motion, you can see how just changing the direction that you're quilting, and it really looks like water and has a fun water effect. But we're going to stick, like I said, we're going to stick to this one today because it's going to be really easy to work across the quilt back and forth in these kind of lines, rows across the quilt. So grab a marker, grab a pen, and just lazily sketch back and forth. Remember though that you are doing this on a quilt. If you're going to pull out your paper and sketch it super teeny tiny like this, you're going to be quilting forever, and as a first quilt, you may be cussing me and never want to quilt again. So don't do that. Save that for later when you are totally okay spending 20 hours quilting a quilt. Today, we can keep them farther apart. About an inch or so is totally going to be fine. The key is just trying to keep them even. The spacing doesn't matter as much. Whether they're an inch, try to keep them all roughly an inch. If they're a half an inch, try to keep them all roughly half an inch. And that's going to really be the key in making it look polished at the end. Okay, now that we have our foot changed and our feed dogs lowered, I have extra bobbins, we're ready to go ahead and put the machine, and we've practiced our quilting design on paper. We're ready to go ahead and put the quilt underneath the needle and start quilting. So how I'm going to do this, I'm actually going to go ahead and start in the middle of the quilt. So what I'm going to do is on each end, I'm going to roll it up. And this doesn't have to be a perfect roll by any means, but it's going to make it so it's a lot easier to move around underneath the sewing machine, underneath your throat. And it's going to help keep everything in place and easier to move. So I'm just going to roll up this side, and I'm going to go in probably about to the end of that middle row. So all I can see are the floppies in the middle row. So about to there. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and I'm going to start in the middle and work my way out, so that way I'm going to start with the bulk of the quilt underneath the machine at the beginning, and then I'm going to slowly work it out. So the more I quilt, the less quilt is going to be under the throat of the machine. So as you're getting more tired, it will be easier to move around. All right. So now I have that rolled up, so that all I'm worried about is this section in the middle. We'll put that back. So I'm going to take it, and I'm going to actually lift this up kind of on my shoulder, on my lap. Make sure it's not just dragging. By pulling it up here, you're going to help eliminate a lot of the drag that's going to happen. And then I'm going to be ready to go ahead and put my quilt underneath the machine. The last thing I want to talk to you about before we actually start quilting is I'm going to use gloves. These are literally $1 garden gloves from the dollar store. They totally work. They aren't necessarily the best option, but for beginners who are just trying this, who are just starting out, they work perfect. The thing that they aren't the perfect is they're not super snug, they're a little bit bulky. They do make machine quilting gloves if you try this out and decide you love it, ranging anywhere from $10 to $20. Some of them have fingers, like these two fingers that are open, which are nice because then you don't have to take your gloves off to, rethread your thread or clip things. But they're usually a snugger fitting glove, so they're not going to be as bulky and in the way. But what these do is the little pokies on there and the fabric is going to give you more traction as you're moving. It's just going to be a little bit more, almost like you've glued your fingers to the fabric just a little bit. It's not going to be quite as slippery, and it'll be easier to move the quilt around as you're free motion quilting. First thing I'm going to do before I start quilting is I'm going to go ahead and pull up the bottom thread. And how I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and hold the top thread with my left hand, and then I'm just going to use my wheel to take one stitch. After it comes back to the top, I'm just going to pull that top thread, and you can see that it's going to pull that bottom thread right up. Then I'm going to use both of those and kind of move them out of the way, and I'm going to hold them in place the first couple stitches that I take. Also, if you have the option to put your needle in the down position, to stop your needle in down position, I recommend doing that so that it stays where you put it whenever you stop to move your hands. Now I need my gloves. Now there's a couple different ways you can hold this. you can just put your fingers like this and move it around. Some people I've also seen kind of hold the side here and put with one hand down and put it around there. The thing to keep in mind is however fast you go, how fast you're moving the quilt and how fast you're pushing on the foot pedal is going to determine your stitch length. You're not going to get perfect stitch lengths. You're not a stitch regulator, but aim for consistent stitch lengths. So you're going to kind of just have to play with that as you get stitching. So let me just show you, and I'm going to take a few stitches over. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull these out, and I'm actually going to go ahead and trim those a little smaller just so that they don't get in the way. I'm not going to worry about cutting them all the way in. Those will be bound into my binding later, but I want them to not be super long and getting sucked up in the quilting elsewhere. And now we're ready to go, just doing that same back and forth motion that we sketched out. Don't worry about keeping it even. Like I said, more importantly is keeping the spacing is really what you want to be focused on more. As you get started, you're going to want to stop when you move your hands. If you try to move your hands while you're quilting, sometimes the quilt kind of goes into weird places that you don't mean for it to go. And just kind of rearranging the quilt to get as much of it up and off as you can. If you're finding that you're having a hard time moving the quilt or things aren't very smooth, I'm actually going to recommend that you speed up your stitches just a little bit. Don't go too fast. The speeding up can sometimes help smooth things out and make it easier to move stuff around. And you will naturally get wider stitches in the straight spots and skinnier stitches on the curves. Don't stress too much over that. Try to keep them even, but don't stress too much over it. It will look just fine. Just remember, like, this is going to be the most amount of fabric underneath your foot that we're going to have, so we're going to work it all out of there. Another thing I forgot to mention at the beginning is you're definitely going to want to go ahead and double check your tension at the beginning of when you first start quilting. I've got a little pucker I can feel, so I'm just going to work it out really quick before I keep sewing. It's going to be a lot easier to take a few minutes to double check your tension, see that everything's sitting right. Mine's not right. Than it is to go back and unpick it later. So double check that everything is nice and tight and your tension looks good at the beginning of the project. Don't sew your glove to your quilt. We are just about done. And we're just going to work our way, oh, nope, I cut the thread. We're just going to work our way right off the edge of the quilt. This will actually give me an opportunity to show you really quick what we're going to do if we have a thread break or if we run out of bobbin thread. Let me show you really fast how we're going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to unpick a few stitches. Just long enough that I have a nice tail. Oh. I need to be able to tie it. That's what I'm going for. And then I'm just going to do a double knot, and then I'm going to use what's called a self-threading needle, and it's got an open back. And at the very end, I'm going to go ahead and just go through and stick any of those threads inside the quilt sandwich. The self-threading needle makes it real easy. You can definitely use a regular needle, but they're kind of a pain to try to get threaded. The self-threading needle makes it so you can just pop it right in the back of the needle. And then we're just going to start just as if we started at the beginning, by pulling that bottom thread up first before we get going again. And that's going to help prevent any rat's nests on the back of your quilt. Now that I've worked my way off that row, I'm just going to take a few stitches to kind of hold it in place, and I can clip that thread. I'm not going to worry about burying those ones because it's going to end up buried. It's going to end up sealed in the binding when we finish the quilt later. Now that I have that row done, we're going to go back to the beginning, and I'm just going to go ahead and work it all the way across the quilt. But what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to come in and I'm going to fill in. So any spot where this went lower, I'm going to make sure to reach down in and touch that so that I have about that inch of space, that same spacing between curls as well as I finish out this quilt. We are now all done quilting it, and it is ready for binding. So a couple things to keep in mind as you're quilting your quilt, especially if this is your very first one. Take breaks while you're free motion quilting. I do a lot of quilting, and I still starting to feel a little sore in my shoulders and neck. So definitely stop, stretch, and take breaks as needed. Also, make sure not to scrunch your shoulders. That's going to create a lot of tension, so try to keep yourself relaxed. If you find yourself getting scrunched up, take some deep breaths, relax your shoulders, and keep going. Third, on thread with this, I just used a white thread because there's a lot of different colors and things going on. It matches pretty well and it blends. So just a nice basic neutral, I just put white. And finally, I mean, just have fun. Remember that you are a beginner, and that's totally okay. Everybody, you know, a beginner is a great place to start. So give yourself grace, realize it's not going to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be. So just have fun, enjoy the process, learn a new skill, and if you fall in love with it, you can keep going, practice, and you will get better. So next week we will come back and we are going to bind our quilt so that it will be completely done and ready to use. So don't forget to subscribe to our videos, like it if you enjoyed what we're sharing. Check us out on Instagram and Facebook, and you can get the free pattern for our floppy quilt top in our subscriber library on our website. So we'll see you next week.